Linda Wright, and I'm the Dean of Social and Human Sciences Division, and I would like to welcome you all to this program. I also want to tell you that we have index cards on the various tables, and if you have questions throughout the program, throughout the presentation, feel free to write them down on the index cards, and then we'll collect them. What we're going to do is we'll have an introduction by Elise here in just a minute. Then our speaker will give us her presentation. And then we're going to have a question and answer period. And then we'll break for lunch. So those of you, if you do have questions that you would like us to consider, please, and in the interest of time, we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. But do write them down on the index card because I think that will be easier for us to manage. Also, I want to preface this by saying, I don't know if you all watch 60 Minutes. You know, 60 Minutes is usually one of my favorite programs, and I don't think that they do it anymore, but when they first started in well into the 1980s and 90s, they used to have a segment that was called Counterpoint. And if you recall what that segment was, is that they would take one position and have an entire segment devoted to the one position, and then they would have the alternate position and another segment entirely devoted to the alternate position. So what we have done at Tarrant County College is that we also have another date that's scheduled. It's going to be April 24th, and it'll be the same period of time in this same room from 11 o'clock to 2. And those who have the alternate opinion to what's being presented today will have the opportunity at that point to speak and give their opinions in their presentation. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce you to Elise Mahandra. I'm sure I did not pronounce that correctly, but she's going to give our introduction. And again, thank you for coming, and later on in the program, we'll have some goodies for you to eat.
Good morning, and thank you for joining us today. As Dean Wright just said, my name is Elise Mahandra. I'm a student here at TCC Northeast. And the way this event came to be, it actually started out with one of my professors, Professor Martinez, sending me an invitation to try out for a TED Talk for TCC, which just took place last month. And I tried out, I didn't make the final, but she told me, it's like, hey, you know, we really liked what you were saying. Maybe you should look into sharing it with the student body in the campus. So I went on, spoke with my advisors in Psi Beta, and they agreed to help me put this event together. So I would like to say thank you very much. I would like to thank Dean Wright and the administrators for TCC for allowing us to have this event today. So I just want to kind of share a little bit about myself before we get started. As I said, my name is Elise Mahandra, and I'm a confused genocide survivor from Rwanda. And I reckon when I say genocide and from Rwanda, most of you picture the images that we've all become accustomed to when one mentions genocide and Rwanda in the same sentence. In 1994, as my family and I fled from the only home we had ever known, the world became inundated with images of savagery as people slaughtered one another in a little barely known country in Central Africa called Rwanda. In July of 1994, we crossed the border of Rwanda, spilling into the Congo alongside an estimated 2 million others seeking another day. We lived in a refugee camp in Uvira, a small town near Lake Tanganyika, on the eastern border of the Democratic Republic of Congo. There we made contact with my father, who was attending school at the Command Staff College in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. And with the help of his school, we were rescued from the Congo. Upon arrival to the United States, we watched the news. Headline news had the round-the-clock coverage of Hutus mercilessly executing their Tutsi compatriots with machetes. And I remember on several occasions, people would ask me where I was from, and I would reply that I'm from Rwanda. They would ask if I was Hutu or Tutsi, and I would reply, I'm Hutu. And with that answer, their expression will suddenly change, and sometimes with the next question being, so you're the killers. Now imagine being an 11-year-old child who just escaped a refugee camp in the Congo, living behind all they had ever known, with nothing but the clothes on their back. At the surface, this line of questioning brought about an anger in me, but deep down I was confounded by this narrative. I had been there, watching what had transpired. Tutsis were killed, Hutus were killed, Twas were killed, foreigners were killed, children were killed. But most important to me, my grandma, my uncles, and my best friends were killed. So as I was dealing with not only the loss of people close to me and the way of my life, I had to explain to people that I had never killed anyone. As time progressed, I got used to the questions. Sometimes I would take time to explain, other times I would just shake my head. Life went on, and I continued to observe in disbelief as the popular narrative flourished, proclaiming the RPF and Paul Kagame, Rwanda's current president, as the savior of the Rwandan people, despite the savagery they had unleashed on them. I don't want to go on and on. I have people who will speak as to that effect today. I just wanted to share my personal stand and how this came to be. So without further ado, I would like to introduce you to our keynote speaker, Ms. Judi Rever. Ms. Judi Rever is the author of In Praise of Blood, the crimes committed by the RPF, and she hails from Montreal, Canada. She's a freelance reporter who has dedicated a big chunk of her life to research the atrocities that befell our people from the 90s well into the 2000s. So please help me in welcoming Ms. Judi Rever.
Thank you, Elise. I'd like to thank Elise in particular for her courage. What a powerful speech. And for her determination to have voices heard today. I'd also like to extend my appreciation to Talent College, people here I've met, and the people who stood their ground against efforts to get this event canceled, efforts by individuals who support the Rwandan government, who don't want these voices heard today. I'm very pleased to see everyone here, a packed crowd, and I'm relieved there is security as well. Lying by omission, historically speaking, means deliberately misrepresenting an important story. Leaving out crucial facts on purpose suggests malice, and more fundamentally, it changes the story and our understanding of an historical event. It fosters a misconception, and in so doing, has grave consequences. In law, I'm interested in law, a lie by omission is the intentional failure to tell the truth in a situation that requires disclosure. The crucial element that has not been revealed about the Rwandan genocide, that the official narrative has omitted, that Rwandan authorities and their international backers do not want to disclose, is what I've spent 20 years of my life trying to understand. The truth is that Hutu civilians were systematically targeted during the genocide by the Rwandan Patriotic Front, led by Paul Kagame. This truth is that Hutu community leaders, peasants, old people, children, and babies were targeted for elimination. And the victims' families these survivors have been silenced and demonized ever since. I've spoken to hundreds of Rwandans, Hutus, and Tutsis over the years, and some of them can be refreshingly direct. One of them said to me, "I am a Hutu survivor. I survived Paul Kagame's war of invasion from 1990. I survived his death squads in 1994 and later in Congo. And then I managed to flee the country to avoid getting killed afterward." There are millions of Hutu survivors in Rwanda and abroad, just like there are hundreds of thousands of Tutsi survivors in and outside Rwanda whose families were intentionally targeted for annihilation. I know and I accept and believe that there was a genocide against Tutsis in 1994. What I did not know or had never learned was that there was a genocide against Hutus that has been spread out over a number of years and has been hidden from the popular discourse for politically expedient reasons. It was in Congo that I first became viscerally acquainted with the Rwandan Patriotic Front, the RPF. It was there that I began to question the RPF narrative and reevaluate my worldview. I went to the Great Lakes region, Central Africa, for the first time, right after a longtime dictator Mobutu Sese Seko of Zaire was toppled by Paul Kagame's forces in May 1997. I went there to cover the humanitarian crisis. What I saw there fairly quickly was that Rwanda had completely occupied Congo, its cities, small villages, and even strategic areas of the forest. I had the opportunity to go into the forest with local aid workers from the UNHCR, that's the UN Refugee Agency, Doctors Without Borders, and Red Cross. These are local Congolese who were conducting search and rescue missions to find missing Rwandan Hutu survivors. Survivors of attacks by Kagame's Tutsi soldiers, people who, and these survivors had been hunted across Congo like prey. What I saw firsthand was the ugly criminal face of the RPF, the true nature of the regime. I met dozens and dozens of survivors in 1997, men, women, and children on death's door, battling cholera, malaria, typhoid, skin infections of all kinds, and chronic hunger. Some showed me their bullet wounds, and many of them had infections from those wounds. A good number of them appeared catatonic and could not speak, having survived these attacks, and they were psychologically broken. A number of victims told me in graphic detail how Rwandan troops opened fire on their camps, mostly south of Kisangani, where I was, and killed tens of thousands of ailing refugees, scattering many of the others who managed to flee, and chasing these people even more. Some of these survivors were forced at gunpoint to bury their loved ones. Children told me about their parents drowning in the Lualaba River in Congo, letting go of their parents, struggled to swim, and they lost their parents. They were fleeing violence. They were being shot on by Rwandan troops. Refugees spoke about desperately jumping off a ridge in the Butu into the water as Rwandan troops were firing on them. Pregnant women jumped off the bridge, some of them to their death. The scenes in the jungle and those accounts of from refugees themselves being hunted like animals were apocalyptic and have never left me. For many of us who have followed the events in Central Africa, we know what happened to Hutu refugees in Congo. We know what happened because the United Nations has documented some of these crimes. But it was there that I got clues to another story, and that's what my research is really about. I wanted to know why Rwandan Hutu refugees fled Rwanda in the first place, and why they stayed in camps in the Congo after the genocide was over. Why they refused to go home. If the Hutus had killed Tutsis, and the RPF had stopped the genocide. And the international community was insisting it was safe to go back to their homeland. Why didn't they go home? They told me, in Congo, they told me they fled Rwanda in 1994 in the first place because the RPF had killed their families. They were afraid of the RPF. They said they stayed in camps because they were afraid they'd die if they returned. And when I first heard this, it was astonishing to me, and I was skeptical. I had to overcome my own bias, and I admit I had absorbed so much propaganda. But after hearing this anecdotally so many times, the stories began to coalesce and settle into my brain. The refugees also told me that others who had been pushed or encouraged to go home, pushed by the United Nations, were then disappearing after 1996 and 97. So Rwandan Hutus who went home were disappearing. I eventually went to Rwanda, and after my reporting from Congo, and I visited transit camps outside Kigali and in a prefecture called Gitarama. It was there that I met a man who was completely broken in body and spirit. He just returned from Congo, where he had lost his wife and baby at the beginning of the Rwandan invasion. They'd been gunned down by Rwandan troops at one of the camps in front of his eyes. He whispered his story to me because we were mostly surrounded in this UN camp by Tutsi troops. I was in Rwanda. He told me he left Rwanda in 1994 because he was afraid of dying. He told me his first family, his wife and 5 children, among them a baby 3 weeks old, had been slaughtered in Gitarama in 1994. I asked him who was responsible for killing the people he loved. Was he an opponent of the former Hutu regime? Did his family get slaughtered by Hutu militia? No, he said. The Interahamwe militia, as it was known, had already moved on. It was sheer horror, he said. Only God knew what my life would become next. There are some things I can't tell you, he said, shaking his head, and his hands were trembling. He asked me to shut off my tape recorder. I was working for Radio France International at the time. And then he whispered, people talk as though only one ethnic group in Rwanda was a victim of war, and the other was the executioner. But he said that is not true. I realized he was telling me that the RPF had killed his family, and that moment was an epiphany. It was a shock of recognition. And it was, from then on, I began to re-listen to my tapes in detail, and I picked up on a lot of the nuances, and I realized that despite all the media reports in the West about the genocide being a battle between good and evil forces, of light and dark forces, I realized that the story was even more frightening. There was not one category of victim, one category of perpetrator during the Rwandan genocide. There was killing on both sides. And the RPF, which had a great deal of blood on its hands, was still in power and had claimed moral authority. I'd like to state the obvious here today. Most of you are young people doing your studies. There has been, historically speaking, a lack of rigorous, independently conducted interviews with Rwandan Hutu refugees in Central Africa. Why Hutus fled Rwanda in the first place, and there's been a lack of independent, rigorous interviews with Tutsis who have broken with the regime in the intervening years. The lack of empirical studies has been a colossal failure on the part of human rights activists, NGOs, the United Nations, academics, and journalists. And it has impeded our understanding of the dynamics of violence. By believing in the official narrative of genocide, we've bought into a lie which has allowed Kagame and his RPF to gaslight an entire ethnic group, in this case Hutus, and proclaim that, and scoff at the international community and lecture Rwandans on the virtues of how he's running Rwanda today. Gaslighting, do you know what that is? It's when victims question themselves and question the reality of their experiences. It's a common method used by narcissists, dictators, and leaders of cults. They use it to gain more power. That's what Kagame has done. The sad truth is that influential people in the West, including people who worked at the UN and in the media, have helped him gaslight millions of Rwandan victims. Kagame and his ruling party also used the official narrative to justify their invasion of Congo in 1996, claiming that he was going after Hutu genocidaires. That invasion led to the evisceration of a nation and the loss of millions of lives in Congo, in the very heart of Africa. Over the years, I've interviewed hundreds of victims and witnesses, direct and contextual, along with former members of Kagame's army and intelligence who broke free and fled. I've also spoken with lawyers and investigators at the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, set up by the UN in the aftermath of the genocide. I wanted to understand the mechanics of Kagame's killing machine, what the violence looked like, and how they got away with it, and why. The core conclusions of my book, In Praise of Blood, are based on testimony from my interviews and from leaked UN documents. They are the following. Kagame and the RPF ignited the genocide by shooting down the plane that was carrying Rwanda's president, Juvenal Habyarimana, and his Burundian counterpart, Cyprien Ntaryamira. Immediately after the plane attack, Kagame's soldiers and officers from various divisions of the army, military intelligence and training wing, and high command began carrying out systematic massacres behind the battlefront in every area it seized from Hutu forces in every prefecture in Rwanda in 1994. These mobile forces operated with zeal from the northern prefecture of Boyumba down the eastern side of the country through Kibungo to the south, then up through the rest of Rwanda. They operated initially behind the 7th and 157th Brigades of the Rwandan Patriotic Army. These forces targeted Hutu community leaders and then went after peasants. They lured Hutu peasants to meetings, then slaughtered them and buried them, sometimes with Tutsis who had been killed by Hutu militia known as Interahamwe. Sometimes the RPF burned the corpses of Hutu victims on the spot, depending on the circumstances. In many instances, the RPF would load hundreds of people every day, several times a day, onto trucks, and cart them off to a military barracks called the Bureau, or in other places in Akagera Park on the eastern side of the country, and kill people before burning and incinerating the victims. These were highly organized and systematic operations, and taken as a whole, they amount to attempts to destroy, in part, an ethnic group. That is why I say in my book that the RPF committed genocide against Hutus in 1994 and in the following years. So, as Tutsis were systematically being targeted and killed in Hutu-controlled zones, so were Hutus systematically targeted in RPF-held zones during the genocide. The killing units deployed by Kagame's troops and intelligence in 1994 suggest that the RPF leadership studied the methods of the Third Reich. In 1941, mobile units followed the German army as it advanced into Soviet territory. These killing squads were called Einsatzgruppen and were composed of German SSS officers and police personnel who relied on civilian support to identify Jews and eliminate them. The Einsatzgruppen also targeted the Roma, the mentally ill, homosexuals, and communists. Like the mobile units of the Third Reich that fanned across the occupied Soviet Union, The RPF's death squads ranged from Rwanda's northern border with Uganda to the south along the border with Tanzania. The trucks carrying Hutus to Akagera National Park and the open-air crematoriums in the forest there recalled the Second World War's death wagons and extermination centers. There were other ways the RPF used to kill civilians. I want to briefly describe an incident, a premeditated mass murder of unarmed Rwandans carried out by the RPF that would constitute in any court of law part of something called joint criminal enterprise. What's a joint criminal enterprise? It's when individual members of a group can be held responsible for crimes committed by the group that has a common plan or purpose. Somewhere around April 22nd, 1994, just 2 weeks after the president's plane was shot down and genocide was unleashed, the RPF invited thousands of Hutus who had been living in a displacement camp north of Kigali. The RPF attacked that camp, pushed those Hutu refugees, or IDPs, north towards Buyumba and herded them. They were starving, tired, and frightened into a big soccer stadium. They were promised food, drink, and cooking supplies if they went into that stadium. They went inside under escort by the RPF soldiers. A number of RPF military figures showed up at the stadium, including members from military intelligence, there were ground commanders, and a political commissar. One of my sources, a soldier from Kagame's High Command Battalion, those were bodyguards, was stationed outside that stadium. He saw refugees file in, and the RPF senior officers arrived. Another recruit I spoke to, someone I'll call Patrick, from the military police for the RPF, he gave me his account of what happened inside. At nightfall, amid the faint light of cooking fires, military police and high command soldiers from Kagame's forces began to select robust men, and they led them to the stadium's dugout, where they proceeded to shoot them dead. As the refugees began to scream and scramble when they heard these men being killed, the soldiers threw grenades and unleashed gunfire on women, children, and old people. Those who did not die immediately were finished off by the RPF's signature instrument, which is called agafuni. That's a hoe, a sharp hoe. The killing went on for hours. The agony could be heard outside the stadium. The soldiers spent hours clearing out the bodies and cleaning up the mess and putting those bodies on trucks. Some of the bodies were buried in Buyumba, others were taken to a location called Rukoma on the edge of that prefecture. When Kagame found out that the bodies had been buried, he ordered those remains to be dug up because he was afraid of satellites showing the graves. So I interviewed a UN investigator who collected evidence of this heinous crime. He collected evidence from soldiers from Kagame's army, soldiers who directly participated in the crime, those who transported the bodies, those who burned the bodies. In his life, he said he had never seen such a situation where he had so much evidence and no indictment was issued. No one was prosecuted for the Buyumba Stadium massacre in late April 1994. This was the politics of the United Nations, he told me. The proof was there. The tribunal lawyers agreed that indictments should be prepared, but the prosecutions were never allowed to proceed because the tribunal protected Kagame and afforded him immunity. During RPF killings in 1994 and after, obviously journalists and international officials were not present. The few journalists who were on the ground would have been escorted to these areas afterward by the RPF, but were not privy to these operations as they were happening. So these crimes were largely hidden. The United Nations had some degree of knowledge of these crimes, however, as they were happening. There were UN cables revealing that RPF forces had controlled the eastern side of Rwanda down to the southern tip of the border with Tanzania at a place called Ngara, Rukomo Falls. And these forces, the UN knew, were hunting down Hutus, killing them, and dumping the bodies in a river called Kagera. or carting some of the people off in trucks. These cables were not disclosed to the wider public, in particular the press, and the RPF commanders responsible for those killings were never prosecuted. In 1994, many of us were horrified when we saw on our TV screens the bodies of victims floating in the Kagera River in Rwanda, that's in eastern Rwanda, and washing up on the shores of Lake Victoria in June and July. The images of bloated bodies for many in the West came to symbolize the genocide against Tutsis committed by Hutus. But the cruel fact was that Hutus were the victims in that area at Rusumo Falls in southern Kibungo from May, June, and July onward. The RPF arrived and controlled the entire area, eastern area of the country, from north to south by late April onward. Not only did the international community fail to recognize who carried out those grotesque crimes, it demonized Hutus as a group and applauded the RPF for its moral victory. Lies can be very cruel and dangerous because the RPF got off scot-free and was able to commit more crimes following the genocide. And yet we can never forget the monstrous savagery against Tutsis as well by Hutu militia, elements of the state as well, often local, throughout Rwanda. There's another disturbing aspect to these crimes that I've researched. I discovered through UN documents and in my interviews with many of Kagame's former soldiers and officers that RPF commandos, mainly from high command units and military intelligence, infiltrated Hutu militias before the genocide and during, and engaged directly in killing Tutsis in clandestine operations all over Rwanda. These operations created even more Tutsi victims, ignited a greater moral outcry, demonized the Hutu regime and Hutu civilians in general, and helped strengthen the RPF's moral legitimacy. So Kagame and the RPF fueled the genocide against Tutsis as well. The infiltration by the RPF throughout Rwanda was key to its success in seizing territory, and it gives us clues as to how the genocide unfolded. The infiltration obviously was planned in place before the plane was shot down. We see, for example, the way violence was unleashed in Butare in early 1994, the chaos and fear that ensued. Evidently, the violence in Butare in early 1994, before April, was a test case for how violence would play out if the president were assassinated. The RPF never wanted peace. It did not want a broad-based coalition government. It wanted war as a context and excuse to seize power. The RPF not only infiltrated the Interahamwe and other youth wings, but they infiltrated all the Hutu militias. And the number of Hutu politicians were assassinated. I'll give you an example. Félicien Gatabazi, Martin Boutiana in February 1993-94, where the RPF ultimately sparked that violence, which left 37 people dead. So basically, at that point, Rwanda was about to explode. In addition to these commandos, countless Tutsi civilians were being brought into Kigali to the RPF headquarters at a building called the CND. These Tutsi civilians constituted a fifth column for the RPF. The RPF doesn't like me talking about this, but the fifth column is comprised of sympathizers working often clandestinely with the people called the enemy, people trying to overthrow the state. So this fifth column was working with the RPF, and they were called cadres and commandos. By 1993, the RPF had successfully infiltrated the capital and other areas. By April 94, the RPF had 600 cells throughout the country. Cells are just groups of people working as part of that fifth column. There were 147 documented cells in Kigali, in the capital alone. What were the motives of ethnic killings in Rwanda? What were RPF motives? Because that's why, that's the nature of my research. Why did the RPF kill Hutus? There's been a long history of social order in Rwanda. Struggle over land, cattle, and power had been consolidated among a Tutsi monarchy, and Hutus were indentured in that system. And we've seen the colonial rulers exacerbate the ethnic divisions, and we saw a Hutu revolt against injustice, these types of injustices that transformed into a 1959 revolution that led to independence, and many Tutsi pogroms occurred in the late 50s and early 60s, which sent hundreds of thousands of Tutsis out of the country. So what were the motives? The RPF wanted to remove Hutus from political and military power. They wanted their place back. The RPF leadership they grew up in essentially Ugandan refugee camps. They wanted to come home. And in so doing, they wanted to replace Hutus with Tutsis. So what they did was they targeted Hutu teachers, artists, business people, lawyers, and judges, because once the core political, economic, military, and cultural leadership of the previous regime was gone, they would be able to govern with little resistance. The RPF ordered its military to cleanse regions, exterminating as many peasants as possible, especially in the north, because it wanted to mold the population map and secure housing and belongings for Tutsi returnees who had been living for decades in Uganda, but also in Congo and Burundi. As I describe the criminality of the current regime, I know what you're thinking. You're scratching your head, and you're saying, how in the world can people get away with these crimes and be applauded almost universally? RPF developed a strategy that was very convincing to convey its core message. They did this before the genocide. They mastered the propaganda war, and then they waged a war on truth. So the RPF was smart enough to cultivate close ties with academics, journalists, NGOs, human rights activists, and in particular with Western governments in the early 1990s. They managed to conceal or justify their crimes for nearly 3 decades in Central Africa, principally through its military intelligence wing, which exerts tight control over Rwandans at home and abroad. The intelligence wing is called the Directory of Military Intelligence. It's been effective, and it's a highly repressive intelligence and secret service agency. It's called DMI, so I'm going to talk about DMI. DMI is the brain of the RPF organism. I write in my book that it's the mask of innocence that Rwanda wears in order to prevent scrutiny of its record. It's the mask of the victim. All of this is created by DMI. It runs counterintelligence, criminal investigations, and prosecutions. It oversees research, records, and registry department. It has officers and lower-ranking staff in every division of the Army, the Republican Guard, High Command, Gendarmerie, military police. Its agents have infiltrated the regular army at each level of the battalion, from company to platoon to the smallest section. It's like these Russian dolls called matryoshka. You open the doll and you find another one inside. It's also tapped into it did very early tap into the Tutsi civilian population to create militias, whose members were called Abakata in the 1990s. These people were used to cover up, assist, and sometimes participate directly in crimes. The Abakata became the interface between the RPF and UN agencies, NGOs, human rights investigators, and international journalists. They played a crucial role in Rwanda's stagecraft, and propaganda system. Thousands of RPF cadres, now both Tutsi and Hutu, wield significant power in today's Rwanda. They're no longer called Abakata, they're called Intore, a word meaning the chosen one in Kinyarwanda. They work in every profession at home and abroad. They spy on Rwandans in all walks of life, in particular through a neighborhood surveillance system called Nyambakumi that uses agents from military, political, and civilian spheres to exert control. The RPF civilian cadres report to the RPF political bureau called the Secretariat, and they worked hand in hand in creating the official narrative that we are here today to expose. And they constitute a great example of what is lying by omission. The cadres worked closely in 1994 with a woman named Rakia Omar from the NGO African Rights. They helped to direct her writings and had a substantial influence on how the official narrative of Rwanda's genocide has been historically constructed and maintained for over a quarter of a century. Rakia Omar co-authored with British scholar Alex de Waal the defining book called Death, Despair, and Defiance. It's a colossal compendium of Hutu on Tutsi violence published just weeks after the genocide ended. Omar and de Waal were quintessential kingmakers in helping cement Paul Kagame's international impunity. Their 750-page creed was published in September 1994 and unveiled an instant charge sheet of perpetrators and offered a sweeping narrative of how Hutu ideologues conceived their genocidal project against the Tutsis years in advance. The narrative cast the violence in Rwanda as a battle between, as I said before, good versus evil, claiming that only Tutsis were victims and only Hutus were perpetrators, and most of all, African rights depicted the RPF as saviors. It was a compelling story for a time. Death, Despair, and Defiance was considered the Bible at the UN International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. Eventually, African rights ended up on the RPF payroll, working closely with intelligence operatives and even moving into a building that housed DMI. Very good research on this has been done by an academic here in the States at Notre Dame University called Luc Redans. Remember that name. He's shown the degree to which African rights was prescriptive and influential, scolding the international community about who was morally right during the war, who should be arrested and why, defending the RPF against reports that its troops had engaged in violence. It shamed human rights investigators and journalists for calling attention to RPF abuses. Their book primed public opinion on the conflict and shaped how the world viewed the RPF as moral victors and Hutus as perpetrators. Their research has been absorbed and regurgitated uncritically by many scholars and human rights organizations. Human Rights Watch, seminal account of the genocide, Leave None to Tell a Story, was published in 1999 and became the subsequent Bible at the ICTR. That book by Human Rights Watch cites Death, Despair, and Defiance a record 42 times. Rakia's reputation, I want to say, is built on blood, lies, and a cover-up. The dominant narrative has helped create the RPF's false moral legitimacy. As I said, it's demonized the Hutus, and it was used to garner support from the international community to instill Western guilt and encourage foreign donors to give aid, in addition to steering legal proceedings at the UN Tribunal. Human Rights Watch promulgated something called the Akazu conspiracy. That theory stipulated that a tight circle of individuals around President Habyarimana, known as the Akazu, wanted to wipe out the minority Tutsi in order to secure Hutu domination. A senior lawyer at the ICTR's Office of the Prosecutor called the Akazu theory and other tenets of the official genocide narrative an urban myth. Remember, he's a prosecutor at the Office of the Prosecutor. This is not a defense lawyer at the UN Tribunal. The lawyer said, he told me, under no uncertain terms, that an appropriate investigation into the killing of Habyarimana would have unraveled the whole urban myth about how the genocide occurred, why it occurred, and who was responsible. He said there had been a cover-up at the ICTR, a phenomenon which explained the decision not to prosecute Kagame and his senior commanders for crimes they committed in 1994. He told me that because Kagame had command and control of the army, it meant he had direct authority over any criminal acts carried out by his troops or commandos, and therefore he would have been the ultimate indictee. But instead, Kagame was protected for a variety of geopolitical reasons, not least among them, he suggested, for securing valuable minerals in Congo and providing a corridor for their removal to Western markets. Thousands of Rwandan and Congolese people have tried to alert the international community to RPF crimes, but these individuals have been intimidated, jailed, silenced, or killed. At the same time, powerful interests at the United Nations and within Western governments have buried crucial evidence, thereby contributing, and they dismiss the experiences of people who fled, thereby contributing to an environment in which suspicion of an entire ethnic group has flourished and overshadowed, the very foundation of inquiry. The misrepresentation of historical events has enabled a feedback loop of human rights violations that exist to this day. This is why this story is important. I just very briefly, I'm going to wrap up, and I want to tell you about a few of the alarming reports that the West chose to deliberately conceal very early on. At the height of the genocide, there was a UN cable. I talked to you about this earlier in May, that showed Kagame's forces were shooting, stabbing, and burning Hutus, dumping the bodies in the Kagera River. Others were being hauled off in trucks. That was never acted upon, even though the United Nations knew. In September 1994, an international consultant with extensive experience in African war zones named Robert Gersony concluded in a report tabled to the United Nations that 40,000 Hutu refugees were slaughtered in less than 1/3 of the country's communes he visited, and he believed the operations were systematic and amounted to genocide. The UN buried his report to protect Kagame's regime. A whistleblower released it online in 2010. Early evidence from RPF informants indicated that on April 6, Kagame's commandos had shot down the plane carrying Habyarimana and his Burundian counterpart. Their assassinations triggered the genocide, which claimed the lives of several 100,000 Tutsis. Louise Arbour, the Canadian prosecutor of the UN tribunal, shut down that probe in 1997. She argued that the tribunal did not have jurisdiction to investigate the plane attack. Yet Article 4 of the ICTR statute specifically called on the UN to investigate acts of terrorism. A political group comprised of Rwandan Hutu refugees conducted a partial investigation in camps in Congo and Tanzania. That investigation listed the names of 20,000 victims, mostly from northern Rwanda, who'd been killed in RPF zones by Kagame's army. In many cases, the names of witnesses to the killings were listed, and occasionally the names of the alleged killers, who were members of the RPF, were identified in this document. That investigation, which I got access to, was submitted to the ICTR in 2000, but the court buried those findings. A Rwandan human rights activist and journalist named Andre Sibomana collected the names of 18,000 men, women, and children who were slaughtered in the prefecture of Gitarama after the RPF seized that zone in June 1994. Rwanda's prime minister at the time, Faustin Twagiramungu, and former Interior Minister Seth Sendashonga gave those names to the UN tribunal and to the Belgian State Ministry of Justice in 1996. No judicial action was taken. Sendashonga was gunned down in Nairobi by Kagame's operatives. Sibomana, who devoted his life to the vulnerable and the voiceless, died in 1998. Kagame and his apparatchiks, particularly its intelligence wing, have operated like an international mafia. They've killed and tried to kill every person who's openly challenged them. They've blackmailed, corrupted, jailed, and silenced people who might dare to reveal their barbarity. And in so doing, they've ultimately created, with the cover of the international community, a sweeping historical narrative in which the truth has become distorted. The dominant narrative has buried a lot of people. It's only through the power of stories of survivors who are free from Kagame, Tutsi, and Hutu that Rwanda will be able to uncover those bodies and voices underneath and correct this injustice. We have RPF and cadres and other supporters here in this room who wanted to shut this event down and muzzle voices. I thank Elise and her professors and people here at Tarrant College for supporting this event, for refusing to back down in the face of scare tactics, for allowing space for independent expressions. We need to listen to voices, long silence, listen to each other. We need to allow Rwandans to reconstruct the full truth of their past, recognize the wounds inflicted, and pursue the kind of justice Rwandans freely agree on. Only then will reconciliation be possible. Thank you.
We set aside some time for questions and answers, so there's index cards on the table with pens. So if you would write out your questions and hold your card up, and side beta members, if you guys could pick up and bring those together for us. Thank you, Mr. Rever.
I want to thank Psi Beta, our Honor Society in Psychology, and their sponsors, Mr. Mike Leffingwell, Mr. Bonnie McCoy, and also Student Activities, Mr. Victor Ballesteros, for supporting this event. Thank you.
Question is, in your opinion, do you believe that corruption is still prevalent in the UN?
Yes, I do. Recently I've spoken about how the Rwandan government has infiltrated UN agencies. To some extent, it's infiltrated local UNHCR refugee agencies throughout the world, but especially in Africa. We have senior RPF commanders who have been hired by, this is a terrible problem, by the United Nations Peacekeeping Department, and they've been sent all over the world in peacekeeping operations. And so those are just two agencies where they've infiltrated, but there have been a number of them, and the UN actually understands Kagame's record, but there's a usefulness that Kagame provides in terms of providing peacekeepers for the UN. This is useful for the United States in waging its war on terror and expanding its war on terror. So a lot of the Rwanda peacekeepers are valuable, and that's why it's one of the reasons that Kagame is shielded at the UN.
Psi Beta is an honor society for psychology students at two-year colleges, and so we view historical events through the lens of psychology. So this is a question about psychology. I respect your determination. How do you cope with the depression, shock of the people that you've interviewed and you've come across as you researched your work without letting it absorb you mentally?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I've struggled with the stories, very painful stories and emotions of others for more than 20 years. And at times I've had to put the work aside. But, you know, the stories that I first heard in Congo and that pain that I witnessed in many people, they buried it down, and they're always there. And I think in trying to avoid them or taking distance, I think that the pain would bubble up. And there's, I think, a shame in holding on to pain, not sharing it. And I saw the work as valuable in some respects to people who wanted to tell their stories. A number of people did, even in catastrophic states. I think there's a need for human beings to recount what's happened to them and to validate their pain. And so I think a number of them also wanted me to amplify their voices. And for me over the years, because I had set this work aside sometimes, it was too painful, I felt that I needed to get these stories out for my own sense of equilibrium, because I felt that there was a shame in knowing that this was so wrong and having all these stories swirl in my psyche and in my heart, and not being able to tell the stories because I thought they might be too dangerous. So I guess I'm saying that, it's healthier to talk and share than it is to keep things hidden.
In regard to the controversy, one question is, you've been labeled a genocide denier, correct? So why does acknowledging Hutu genocide a denial of Tutsis genocide?
It's not. And this is the crux of the matter. It's a very weak argument that the Rwandan government has leveled against me and many people, that talking about crimes the RPF committed against Hutus somehow denies the genocide against Tutsis. It does not. In no way does it negate or minimize the suffering of Tutsis. That tactic of labeling people like me a denier, a negationist, or calling Hutus génocidaires when they call attention to their own suffering is simply a strategy to shut down debate, shut down attempts to expose what Kagame and his regime have actually done. It's to deflect from the issue and their record.
So these events began, we're looking at 25 years ago, and many of these students are 18, 19 years old. So one question is, for a student who, a lot of this is new information, all of it, what is the most important takeaway from events of this nature? What's your message to these students as far as a takeaway?
I guess, I would say I see all these young faces, think critically about what you read in history books and in the media. Do your own research, come up with your own decisions, meet people. It's very, very important, I've come to realize, to listen to people who flee. If that's the message that I can convey to you today, it's that the world failed when it refused to listen to Hutus who were fleeing the violence in 1994. It listened only to Tutsis who were left in Rwanda, in Kagame's controlled Rwanda. That was a highly difficult setting for Tutsis to tell the complexity of their story, and they listened only to often Hutus who were manifestly controlled and influenced by Kagame's regime at the time as well. They did not listen to people who fled. They did not, and they have not largely listened to Tutsis who have fled. There have been waves of Tutsis since 1999 and 2000 who have fled. Former officers, former soldiers, very good people. So my message would be to listen to the people who flee these kinds of barbaric regimes.
You're one of few voices with challenging the historical narrative. So 2 questions, I'll put them together for you. How long do you think it will take for this to be fully exposed, if you believe it will? Also, you mentioned the RPF wanting to stop this perspective from being spread. How have you personally experienced this?
Well, to answer your first question, it's very hard to estimate how long it will take before people come to fully grasp the complexity of violence and to understand what Kagame's regime did, what his army did during the genocide, and what it has done since. I think a lot of work has to be directed. We have to challenge our own governments, our Western governments, to fully investigate and come to terms with this. We make the West accountable, and then we get a better sense of truth. I don't think that the full truth will be able to be exposed until Kagame leaves power. And I really have no idea when that will be. In terms of my own experience, I have been a target of this regime. I was a target as a young woman who started off as a journalist. I went to Congo very green, and I had security problems. I was naive enough to think that I could report on what Hutu refugees, survivors had experienced at the hands of Kagame's troops. I thought that I could report that story in the Congo in '97. I tried to report it, and the villa where I was staying at was shot at, and I had very frightening experiences in Central Africa during that entire trip. So that was the first problem. And then when I ratcheted up my research from 2012 and 2013, I started having real security issues in Montreal. There was a threat leveled at my family, and I also had trouble traveling in Europe. In one of my trips, I arrived in Brussels, and the Belgian state security met me at my hotel and said that they were mandated by the Belgian government to provide me with a week's worth of round-the-clock surveillance. And I said, why? And they said, the Rwandan embassy poses a threat to your life. We have credible intelligence, credible information. So that gave me a sense of how dangerous the RPF could be. We know that the RPF has killed Rwandan dissidents abroad, South Africa, Kenya, Uganda. But they operate in the West as well, and these are very dangerous people. They operate mainly and organize and plot through their embassies.
In regard to civilian Tutsi, have you been able to reach out to Tutsi survivors genocide and explain to them that you're not denying that genocide? If yes, what's their response typically, and or their reaction to your book?
The reaction among Tutsi survivors has been excellent. It's fantastic. I'm in touch with many, and you know that their stories are unusual. The stories that need to be told are of Tutsi survivors who have Tutsis whose families have been killed by Hutu militia often, but Tutsis who have broken from the regime. And many of them have told me that their families were also killed by the RPF. I was having lunch last year with someone, and she told me that when she got to her home in an area of Rwanda in July 1994, she wanted to see, I won't say where she went, it was her home village, she went to see if her mother and her siblings were still alive. And she told me that she found her mother. And her mother, she described her mother as an uneducated Tutsi peasant, but very forthright. And her mother was hysterical. And the mom had said, you know, your sister has been killed, and the other siblings scattered. But she said the mom said to her that the Hutu militia had come into that village and that area and killed 100 people. And then the RPF came in and killed about 1,000 Hutus and Tutsis. And she said, these people are demons. And my friend, who's a Tutsi survivor, said, Mom, calm down, just don't say anything. These are stories that Tutsis were unable to tell. There are stories all over Rwanda that have been buried. So yes, I'm very much in contact with Tutsi survivors.
We're just about out of time, so appreciate you being with us today. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. And welcome to those of you who are just joining us for the 12:30 class period. We have a panel discussion that is planned for about the first, 45 minutes, what did we say? It's from 12:45 until what time? Okay, testimonials, and then we'll have time for questions again. And if you notice, there are index cards on your tables. And if you will write your question down, we'll come around and we'll collect them and we'll try to get to as many as we can. I want to mention again, because we've had new people coming in and out of the room, that this today is the presentation. We're approaching this as though it's a debate with a point and a counterpoint. You know, today is one side of the issue. We've reserved, April 24th, which is a Wednesday, from 11 o'clock until 2 p.m., the same period of time that we've used for this forum today, and that's time that's reserved for the other side of the issue. So we just want you to be aware of that. As an institution of higher education, you know, we're about providing both sides of an issue. So because of that, we have these two sessions planned. So if you've not gotten something to eat, please help yourself. I mean, it looks like we have plenty of chicken nuggets back there, and they're always a fan favorite on this cold April 1st day. But I'm going to turn it over to Elise now, and she's going to introduce our panel members. And then also, if you have questions throughout the presentation, please jot those down on the index cards, and there'll be a number of us that will circulate throughout the room and collect those so that we can use them during the question and answer. Thank you. And again, thank you to our president, Dr. Tita Fulkerson, for being here today and hosting this event, and the others that I mentioned earlier.
Thank you, Dean Wright. And as she just mentioned, we are getting ready to start the second part of our event for today. So at this time, I want to go ahead and introduce our panel members. The first speaker we're going to have is Celestine Mohindra. Celestine was a major in the Rwandan army up until his resignation in 1994. He currently resides in Fort Worth, Texas, and he will be here talking to us about his experiences in Rwanda prior to the genocide, whether it be just everyday living or things that he might have encountered while he was on the front. Our second panelist today is Sylvie Sibomana. She will be joining us I guess you can't see her yet, but she's here. She'll be, I guess, Skyping in. And Sylvie was late teens, early 20s during the Rwandan War, and she will be talking to us about her experiences as a refugee during that time. And then our third, but not definitely not least, of our panel members is Dr. Hadija Nyansekuye. And Dr. Nyansekuye is a professor at UNT in the School of Social Work. And she will be talking to us today about just the aftermath and just her experiences from a social work perspective is in regards to raising her children after they've encountered this, and just for general outlook from a social work perspective. So please help me in welcoming our panel members.
Good afternoon. My name is Celestine Windra, as I was introduced, and I would like to speak about a quick review of before and during the 1990 war up to the Arusha Peace Agreement. But first of all, I would like to thank our keynote speaker, Judi Rever, for accepting to come and share her research. I would like to thank her after reading her book of all she went through, but she persevered. I would like also to thank Tarrant County Community College, especially the Chancellor, Gervanini, for accepting this event, despite a lot of pressure trying to prevent this to happen. First of all, in my presentation, I would like to say how things were before the Rwandan War. Rwanda is a small country in Central Africa. It has mainly 3 ethnic groups, all blacks. They are, right now they say there's no ethnic group, but it used to be, when I left, used to be 3 ethnic groups: the Hutu, the Tutsi, and the Batwa, the Twa. I will not go in statistics because whoever want to look at can look it up online. We have more documentation. So the Rwandan community before the war was kind of tolerant to one another. They had been in trouble before in the 60s, but around 90s, the Tutsi and Hutu were getting along. The proof is I'm a Hutu I had many friends Tutsi. And so many of my friends were killed by the Hutu militia. So the country was relatively tolerant to each other. The main problem we had in Rwanda was more regionalism between the southern and the northern than the ethnic issue. There was also a problem of refugees. I remember there were refugees who came from Uganda. They were settled in the northern part of the country. Many people had different opinions about the refugees. Many people wanted them to stay, but those in power, those who control the politics, didn't want to resolve the problem that way. They decided to send them back to Uganda. Many Rwandans would have liked to settle with our brothers who had come, but it didn't go the way of the majority. And you know, in those countries, dictatorship sometimes prevails. And how did the war start? I was in the army. Some people think that it was a surprise, but it was not. Everyone was aware of the war coming. Myself, I was stationed in Byumba. I was moved to Mutara in 90, I think it was 89. The unit that was there had gone for training. I stayed there for a month. I could really see that there were infiltrations, there were sporadic attacks against the population. We knew the war was coming. We did not know the date, but we knew that the war was coming. My experience during the war. At the beginning of the war, I struggled a lot because I was coming from the south of the country, and there was no, as I say, there was no trust, no full trust between the northern and the southern. When I was stationed in Byumba, the prefect of that prefecture didn't trust the southern. So when the war started, I was kind of removed from command. And actually I was also moved to another prefecture where there were no soldiers. So they were investigating me. They thought I was pro-RPF because of my connection with my friend Tutsis. And I didn't really, during that time, there was no animosity between Hutu and Tutsi. Tutsi and Hutu will do business together. They will, as an example, my daughter Alice, who was speaking, her godparents are Tutsi. And one of my friend who was killed by Indian Army is Mr. Dimio, who was Alice's godparent. So really, there was confusion because they didn't know who supports RPF, who didn't support the RPF. So I was moved somewhere, but after the investigation, they found that I was not really related to RPF. So I was kind of clear. So when I was cleared, I was sent to Rwanda, and I was chief of operations in one one brigade was created. And in 1991, I was promoted to major and also was appointed to have a battalion. So I fought in Muvumba commune. I know exactly what happened over there. When I was reading the book, many things and names that came up were known to me. Nyarurema, there was a center of a center. That center of center was attacked by RPF. They took medication, they killed people over there. So when I read the book, to me, it was true, because it was an experience I read. The attack of Rwandan. When the war started, the people of Muvumba were kind of moving from their property. It was an area very, very rich in crop. So we had a line of defense at the border, but there were infiltration between our lines, because they cannot occupy all the terrain. So when the RPF infiltrated, they come in there at night, they kill the people in our real lines, so the people will start fleeing. So after they fled, they group them at those refugee zones. It started in Muvumba commune at Webari. That camp was bombarded by RPF. So the refugees, we had to protect them. We had to put some units to protect the refugees, but the attack continued. The war went from 90 up until 1993, when the government, the former government kind of was replaced by a transitional government made up with opposition leader. So with the opposition leader coming in the government, most of them really wanted a political settlement, because we realized that these were our brothers. They were labeled enemy, but they were Rwandans. They were just labeled, but why should we continue to kill our brothers? Why should we fight? So the idea came in the mind of the politicians. Then there was an idea of negotiation. So the opposition thought that a negotiated settlement was the best way, and it was the best for the country actually. So negotiation started around 92. So they eventually reached an agreement, a peace agreement that was signed in Arusha in August 1993. So the agreement gave hope to both groups, to Rwandan, most Rwandan who were living inside, and even, I think it gave hope to everyone. So at the time, there was a plan to work together with the RPF member and the RPI. The armies were going to be brought together and live together as brothers, because we are all brothers of Rwanda's brothers. They signed the agreement. The process of integration started, but at the time, that's when I came to start, because even the education training resumed. My training to the United States was kind of stopped because of the war, and I was allowed to come pursue my military studies in the United States. And I came in November 1993. I was training in a Lackland Air Force Base down here in San Antonio. That's where I learned about the new war. Because the first one was over, there was a new war that had started already. It was painful for me because my family, they were kids, they were small. I couldn't be there to assist them. Anyone could just battle them, but they managed to escape. Difficult. So they went to Congo. My wife, my courageous wife, was able to struggle and get a phone and call me. While in Congo, we were able to restore contact, and I was able to find a way to bring them here. At the time, I was 8411 Worth, Kansas, at the United States Army Command Engineer Staff College. That time, to me, I was watching what was going on. It was like crazy. When you see on picture, and I knew the villages, I know people killing people. It was just terrible. I lost many people. As I said, I lost my two brothers-in-law. They were Hutu, but they were killed by the Hutu militia. I lost many people. I lost friends. I lost the mayor, as I say. I lost many people because I have many friends. I lost my cousin. My cousin was a Tutsi. He was married to a Hutu. When, after he was dead, he couldn't even mourn because the wife couldn't mourn because they started attacking her. She lost her husband, and she couldn't mourn her husband. There was, but only part of inner land, on the part of our place. I lost the entire family of the remaining family of my wife's family. They were all killed in a meeting in Rwanda, in community about sisters, mother-in-law, their children. They were all killed. So, it is a dilemma for many Rwandese, not just me, many Rwandese, because right now, there are people who were in RPF, who fought on the side of RPF, who are being killed too. So, the situation is kind of requires some thought and some fairness. I will stop here because my time, if I had more time, I would say more. But I will stop here. So I will say one thing. There's a saying in Kinyarwanda, umuntu ni muntu, which means a human being is like any other human being. We should just put aside our emotion, our partisan, and think as human. And understand if someone lost a brother or they lost them. Whether Tutsi, whether Hutu, those are human beings. So I will stop here and would request from our government the government of Rwanda to allow all Rwandans who lost their people to mourn them. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon, you all. Thank you for staying along. It's been a very interesting conversation. Not that the subject matter is new to me, but I'm always impressed and I'm very appreciative every time I had a chance to talk about my beloved country, despite all the negative, ugly truth that's part of our history. My name is Hadija Nyirazikuye. I am from Rwanda. I teach course in social work at the University of North Texas. I teach human behavior in the social environment. I also teach social welfare policy. I am a mother of 4 and a grandmother of 6 little boys. So I'm a grandmother of 6. And I like to start my conversation by talking about my grandsons, because this being the United States, me being a black woman from sub-Saharan Africa, those are 6 little boys who are black little boys growing up in the United States. And you're probably thinking that doesn't have anything to do with the genocide. It may not be directly related to the genocide, but as far as I'm concerned, it's an issue of social justice and being black, a black person in this country. At least for us who are black, we understand how powerful and how meaningful your race is, or the skin of your color. In other places, it's not as much the skin color, it's other things that makes people other, not part of the mainstream. When I talk about my little boys, I also think about the course I teach, human behavior in the social environment. I also think about my research interest and the reason I came to this country. When I arrived in this country in 1998, I went to school at the School of Social Work at the University of Denver in Colorado. I went on to get a master's in social work and then went on to get a PhD. And in the course of doing my research for my dissertation, I wanted to do research on this being a social work topic. I wanted to research what it meant for refugee women from the Great Lakes region of Africa to be recipient of refugee services here in the United States. And the reason I was interested in that is because I got to know them. I got to know what it meant to be a refugee. I got to know about the wars that I have been a part of. And I also got to work with them on different projects and was struck by the contradiction or the discrepancy between their understanding of the world around them and their understanding of the same world by the people who were serving them. So I went on, designed a research project, and I started my interviews, and I was surprised to hear the women talk over and over again before they tell me about what it means to be a refugee in this country, to be a recipient of refugee services. They all wanted to talk about the wars, what has happened in their countries, in Burundi, in Rwanda, in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And I remember being completely distressed and thinking that I needed to change my topic because I went back and having the same nightmares I used to have during the war and after the war in my earlier life in the United States. So I went to my advisor and I told her I thought I had made a mistake. I didn't want to talk about, I didn't want to interview those women because they didn't understand my question. My wonderful advisor, Dr. Susan Manning, said to me, she says, Hadija, you're doing a phenomenology, and as a phenomenological researcher, your presupposition and everything you know about the topic is going to be part of your data. So what was my presupposition? where were my nightmares coming from? My nightmares were coming from what I have gone through, like all Rwandans, or at some point where refugees in our country, or we were persecuted in our own country, or we were fled, or we had slept outside, or we have seen loved ones die, or we have to lie to the authorities so we can get away with persecution. In any case, I had to sit down and write my own story, which was getting in the way of me telling the story of the women I was interviewing. So I wrote those very first drafts in 3 weeks. I went back and did my research and defended my dissertation, and then had to go back after that to refine my writing, which came out as a memoir. It's called The Lances Were Looking Down, One Woman's Path Through the Rwandan Genocide in Life in the United States. Part of my journey as a social worker was threefold. One was as a social work researcher. Yet my research interests were in forced migration, issues of genocide and genocide prevention, indigenous healing practices, and international social work research and practice. I was interested in all those topics because they had some intersection of some sort. Those who have spoken before me, much appreciated. Alice's introduction, Ms. Judi Rever's, your wonderful research and unbiased perspective. Those who have spoken about before me have spoken about the wars in Rwanda. They have spoken about, Celestine just talked about the refugees, and I was working with refugees. And I could see that there was some kind of correlation between persecution, between discrimination, between bullying, between macroeconomic and the interest of the West in Africa, in our region in particular. So I was interested in all those things, hoping to start a conversation that hopefully was not able to stop what had happened before, but maybe could inform what could happen later on in future generations. So as a mother, I worry about what's going to happen to my children. I'm sure your parents do, or if you're parents, you're worried about what's going to happen to your children or to your grandchildren. So that's never far away from my mind. And when I think about what could happen to my children or to my grandchildren, I can't help what has happened to my people. And so my search, my quest, is what kind of world, what kind of environment, what kind of community do we want to build today so that what has happened to the Rwandans won't be happening to other communities. Unfortunately, we know that as Rwanda was happening, so was East Timor, and those came at following the Holocaust that many people know about, and that came following what was happening in Sudan and what was happening all over the world. So I thought maybe we need a different perspective. What is it that we need? So when I started the Genocide Prevention Conference, it was less about Rwanda and it was about people really talking. Talking about who they are, and other people, and everybody listening not about you, listening about the other people that you think you don't have anything to hear or to know about them. Stories matter. That young woman, Chimamanda Adichie, the Nigerian, she's my favorite novelist. The one who, if you haven't had a chance to listen to her about the danger of the single story, We all have seen those stories about people who are not like us. We all have made up our mind of who our next neighbor is. But we don't take a chance, we don't take the time to listen to that neighbor. And when we listen to them, we already have a response in our mind that we want to answer them already. We want to refute what they're saying. But in social work, I learned about listening. I learned about listening not only so I can rephrase what my client is saying, but I wanna listen so that I can move the conversation to a positive resolution. So when I talk about Rwanda, and I talk about Rwanda to different people, to students, to church groups, to academician, non-academician, it's because I want those people to know about Rwanda, but for Rwanda to hear about other people too. Because if we don't listen, if we already decide that we know what the truth is, and we don't make room to hear all those other stories that we didn't know about, that we have already decided we know something about, I am afraid we're going to be running in cycles. I'm afraid that my little black grandsons, like your grandsons or your nephews or yourself, are going to be living the same world that we thought we left behind. I think I'll stop there and let you ask questions. Thank you.
Okay, at this time, we have another guest on our panel who was not able to make it in person today. Her name is Sylvie Sibomana, and she will be speaking to us from Dayton, Ohio. Please help me in welcoming Sylvie.
Hello. Yeah, my name is Sylvie Sibomana. I was born in Rwanda, and when the genocide happened, I was only 15, and it was a nightmare for all of us Rwandans because we were all living together, but all of a sudden, when the presidential airplane was shot, it was around 8 p.m. that night, and he was coming from the negotiation with the, like Muhindura said earlier, we had a war that started in 90. So the presidential airplane was shot in 1994. During that time, he was coming from the negotiation to see how the majority Tutsis who were refugees can come home peacefully. Part of them were already in the country at that time, but they were trying to see how they can have a smooth transition in the country without having to fight or kill innocent people. At that time, when the plane was shot, a lot of people were angry, so that's when the killing started. When they were killing, the majority of people who were killed were Tutsis because it was believed that the plane was shot by the Tutsis who were fighting during the war. So that's why most people who were killed during that time were Tutsis. But that does not mean that Hutus were not also killed during that time. Most of the time we hear that during the genocide that happened in 1994, only Tutsis were killed, but it's not right. It does not, like most of the time that they say that only if you try to say that Hutus were also killed, that means you are a genocide denier. That's not the truth, because I was there, was only 15, and my father, who was a Hutu, and then I also have family members who were also mixed, like Muhindura said earlier, we were all living together. People were intermarrying, we had friends, and my family is also mixed, so we had both Hutus and Tutsis killed during the 1994. So when the war started, for me, some people were killed because of their physical appearance. That's another thing that people don't know, because really, whether Hutu or Tutsis, there is no, we all speak the same language. So it was difficult to differentiate or to tell who is a Hutu or a Tutsi, except that the Belgian came then tried to differentiate us by physical features. So it was more of who is thin with a slim nose and who is short with a big nose. But like I said, people were intermarrying, so it was very difficult to tell who is who. Some you could tell, some you could not, because we all speak the same language. So during the killings, Hutus, Tutsis were killed as well. They were more likely looking at your physical features, and then some people knew who you were, probably because by talking to each other. And most of the time, people started, for me, I didn't know about the ethnicity until the war started in 90, because we didn't talk about those things. But during the war in 90, that's when people started looking at each other, wondering who you are, whether you are Hutu or Tutsi. But before that, for me, I didn't know that, we had ethnicity, that we were different. So I would like to say thank you, a very, very thank you to Judi Rever for writing that book, because he has shown the other side of the story that is not being told. Most of the time we hear the genocide against the Tutsis, but there is also a genocide against the Hutus. With my story, like I said, there were several times when the presidential airplane was shot. They started killing Tutsis, but there were also Hutus who were killed during that time. And when we mourn for those who died, we also forget the president who was in that airplane with other dignitaries that were coming with him in the airplane. And there was also a president of Burundi that most of the time people don't talk about. And there were also other people who were killed because of their political parties. There were other political parties like the people who were Hutus themselves, but because they did not agree with what the militia or Hutus or the other party which was more powerful, a lot of people died. And their families, and those people were Hutus. Well, I can say some of the names, like we had a friend called Nzamurambaho. He died with his whole family. I have also other friends and family who were killed during that time because of the political party that they belonged to. When the war was going on and the killings as well, not only Tutsis died, and even though they also say that the militias were only Hutus, there were also militias who were Tutsis killing other Tutsis. As we have seen, the president of the militia, which is alleged to have killed the Tutsis, he was also a Tutsi himself, the president of that militia. So it is really difficult to really understand exactly the issue of Rwanda. I know most of the time is more about the ethnicity, but for me, as I was young at that time, I've been trying to figure out, to read more into the story, to figure out exactly what happened and what is the issue. is it really ethnicity or there is something behind? It is, the more research I do, is I find more of issues of minerals that is being used so they can get minerals, especially cotton, so we can use our computers, we can use our phones, we can get the diamonds and stuff like that. And then people hide behind that so they can bring conflict with the people. So as a when I became a refugee, I went into different countries. My first one was DRC, which is Democratic Republic of Congo. When we went there, we did not stay for long. It was only a 3 months trip because it was not safe there. The RPF came there and was killing people. It was not that, most of the time they said they were there to kill the militia, the Hutu militias who committed genocide, but most of the people who died were women and children. And those people did not commit the genocide. So we moved and went to Tanzania. When we went to Tanzania, we stayed there for 2 years, and then we were forced to go back home. When we went back home, I can vividly remember some of the people that were killed when we went back. There is a family that they were businessmen. They have 3 or 4 brothers with their wives and children. It was a family of 28 people. That family was killed on the spot. Kids, women. Only one family member was survived, and he still lives, but he ended up losing his leg. There is another family as well that was killed. The whole family was wiped out. This guy was called Sebahile. He was also a military before the genocide, so his family was wiped out. I have a lot of friends, family members who were killed in DRC, who were killed when we went back to Rwanda from Tanzania. I have a lot of family members who were killed also during the genocide and even after the genocide, because they used to have things that they call meetings. They'll call people to come for meetings, like on a stadium, and then once people arrive, they'll start killing the whole all those who were there. So we have names, we have and all these people were innocent. Yes, there are people who committed this genocide, but doesn't mean all Hutus committed the genocide. And the good Judi Rever book illustrates a lot of issues that we are faced with, especially even abroad. Even for some of us who are abroad, we are not allowed to say our story. We are not allowed to express what happened, because only one story is allowed to be spoken, which is not good. If for a generation or for a population to heal, you need to hear both sides. So there is these killings going on abroad, here in US, in Canada, in Europe, in Africa. They are going around still killing Hutus or anybody else who is outspoken, who want to talk about what really happened. They are not allowing all Rwandans to grieve or Rwandans to speak up for what really happened in Rwanda. And for me, the message that I really wanted to bring out is to work together so that we can stop all these killings going, because really they are still killing innocent people. The U.S. just released, if you look on last month, about the human rights here, about what is going on in Rwanda. The genocide is not over, it's still going on. There are still refugees in DRC, there are still refugees coming from Rwanda, there are still refugees going all over the place, but those refugees are not allowed to speak up. Because everybody who tries to speak is killed or disappeared. Nowadays they use poison, which even when you go to the hospital, they can't figure out what is wrong. So it is really very important to work together to fix it and to allow all Rwandans to grieve. Not only Tutsis died, Hutus also died, and they are still dying.
Okay, so
I will conclude saying that with using this quote, that the world suffers a lot, not because of bad people, but because of the silence of the good people. This is by Napoleon, sorry. So we can work together to really help Rwandans because they are suffering in silence. Thank you.
Thank you, Sylvia. Please stay on the line. We're about to go into Q&A right now with the panel. So if you could please stay on the line in case there's a question that's directed to you, we'd appreciate it. And thank you for sharing.
We're going to move on now to question and answers. So you've got index cards on your table of kids. If you would write down your questions and hold them up, we've got a team of volunteers who are picking those up. Once again, on April 24th, on Wednesday at 11 o'clock, we're going to reconvene for Counterpoint. That's being organized as we speak. So we're going to question and answers, and then we'll hear from the dean as we wrap up to get people to their classes if you have it at 2 o'clock. As you write your questions, I want to make a little plug for our Psi Beta National Honor Society for psychology, students interested in psychology to your schools. That group organized this event, worked together. My name is Mike Leppingwell, one of the advisors, along with Yvonne McCoy, Janelle Buck in the back, and Sandra Martinez with us. So, if you have your questions, hold them up. Ms. Rivera, we had a question, a holdover from the first session. The question was asked, when was the last time you were in Rwanda and where did you visit?
I left Rwanda in 1997. I had a hard time doing interviews with people freely and safely. The RPF was trailing me everywhere I went. In fact, the interviews that I was conducting in transit camps and in villages were not only dangerous for me, but my biggest concern was the danger it was posing for the people I was interviewing. I did my best, but some of the security problems I had started in the Congo because the RPF did not like the fact that I had publicly stated on CBC, Canadian Broadcasting Corporation radio, that it had killed Hutu refugees south of Kisangani and in Bandaka in western Congo. And I thought that they were going to kill me, and I felt very chilled and afraid for my life and the life of others while I was in Rwanda. That was in 1997. I haven't gone back. There are no journalists who can operate freely and critically in that country.
There is controversy about using the term genocide and the killings of Hutu as you described in your book. and has been discussed here today. If you know, this is the question, if you know the definition of genocide, it has to be planned. How can you say people still killed and Hutus are still the majority in Rwanda? So who would like to address that?
I can, Sylvie, do you want to say something there?
The thing about the majority is that the Hutus were the majority. From the statistic, Hutus were 85%, the Tutsis were 15%, and then the rest, not 15 probably, 13, and then the rest were Twa, which we rarely talk about them, but we also have another tribe. So the Hutus has been the majority for a long time, so that's why we still have a higher number. And then with the intermarriage is really difficult to really tell, because then we have a lot of Hutus married to Tutsis. And most likely if we are more patriot, like if your father is a Hutu and your mother is Tutsis, you are automatically Hutu.
I'd just like to add something there. The question is, how can we say there was a genocide against Hutus if they're still the majority? And I think it's very clear. The definition of genocide is the intents and the acts to go along with that, to destroy fully or in part a group, in this case an ethnic group. So fully or in part. There were systematic attempts to destroy Tutsis in 1994. There were systematic attempts by the Rwandan Patriotic Front under Kagame to destroy in part the Hutus as an ethnic group. They did so. They tried, and they were enormously successful at attempting to destroy a good percentage of Hutu community leaders in every zone that they controlled. Then they went after peasants for those lands. That is the definition of genocide.
So this is a statement more than a question, but it'll lead me to the next question, or lead us to the next question. If you research the events that occurred 25 years ago, this statement points to something that I read. It said, just want everyone to know that during the genocide, they, when they're reporting to the authorities, used your government-issued ID to know who's Tutsi and who's not. And while I know there's a lot of controversy about this subject, get that. But I think one thing we can all agree on is that some very bad things happened a long time ago and continue. So this question has come up a number of times from a number of tables. Basically it says, what can we do as students? What can we do today so something like this doesn't happen again? And what can we do if we want to help? So can we go to each panel member, just take a moment, if you would, and give us your thoughts.
Let me start. I think the solution for our country is to accept the bad thing that happened. And like I said in my conclusion, a human being is like any other human being. Recognize what happened, and then give everyone the right to mourn their dead, and then move towards a democratic society, which can heal, because if everyone is represented, this thing can be discussed, this issue can be completely resolved. I think, to me, it's just being human. Stop chasing people, stop killing people, just face the national future of non-killing. Stop intimidating people. Just let people be free. Their country is very good. Their country has many people, many good people. They can really create a very good society in Central Africa. So if we all believe the other person is also a human being and stop intimidating people, those things will end. Again, this goes through a rule of law. If someone does something wrong, they need to be punished. If there is no punishment, they will continue to do it. Thank you.
I'd like to add that as students here, you're probably not going to go stop the genocide wherever it's happening, because it's continuing to happen all through the world. But there are small things that kind of hints to warning signs. Don't tolerate bullying. Bullies are those ones who at some point can, if they have an audience, they think they have permission to bully people. And from bullying, they will not move to mass shooting, and the mass shooting will escalate to demonizing, dehumanizing other people. Don't tolerate bullying. There are warning signs. When you start looking at a group of people and looking at that group of people as being the cause of all evils, that grouping people and calling them names and laughing about it. Don't laugh about people who are demonizing other people. Belong to groups of that fight for social justice. The other thing that I think that our student that kind of escape our student is that if you psychology major, you probably don't worry about things that happens across the world or happens or where your cell phone comes from or where your computer comes from. Those issues of macroeconomics, Rwandans kill each other with machetes and bullets, but we don't make bullets, we don't even make machetes. And those are the things that were used in addition to bad propaganda on both sides. So at your own level, on an individual level, there are things that you can do. Speak up when you hear about intolerance. Speak up when people are lying about other people. Speak up when people are demonizing other people. Thank you.
So we want to address that question of what students can do and learn from, and so this doesn't happen again.
Hello. For right now with student is so far we know that we're going to have the 25th commemoration of the genocide, and this has been recognized only the genocide against Tutsis. I want, can we work together to recognize that the Hutus as well were killed? Because if we only allow one side to grieve, we only allow one side to tell what happened to them, and then it will be difficult to reach reconciliation. We need to work toward allowing everybody to grieve, to tell their story, and then we'll be able to really reach a common goal. If we start today, I know there's a lot of people trying to also focus only the genocide against Tutsis, and it has been proven that there was also a genocide against Hutu, which is also still going on. People are still dying till now. How can we stop the genocide? How can we let the world know that it's not over? How can we allow everybody to grieve and tell their story? So I'll ask the student if they can spread the news so we can start allowing everybody to grieve and allow everybody to be part of the story, not only one side.
thank you to our panelists. This will be our last question of the afternoon, and this really, I think, is a preview for our next part of this information series, this discussion, as we explore the other viewpoint. So there's several questions. Really, it seems like there's an issue with using the term genocide. And so both questions are to the UNT professor social worker guest on our panel. Can you define revenge that was committed by Tutsi after 1994 as simple crime rather than calling it genocide? I feel like it doesn't exist. And do you want to address that?
Social worker, that would be me.
Interesting. Congratulations.
For a crime to be defined or to be determined as genocide, that has to come from a court of law. So I am not the one who's defining, I'm not the one who's making a determination. But as somebody who was there during those mass killings, I heard literally people saying to Atimati, which in Kinyarwanda means let's kill all of them. On the other side, even though I do know about Hutus who have died at the hand of the RPF, I didn't hear the RPF saying so. Now, I am not, once again, I don't have the laws, authority, or the jurisdiction, what do you call it? The jurisdiction or the moral authority to decide that a genocide has been committed against the Hutus. Beside what has been seen, a court of law would have to make that determination. I don't know if that's satisfactory.
I just wanted to say one thing adding to what she said. I take your point, and I think that's a very sound assessment. However, with regard to the genocide against Tutsis, people were calling it a genocide against Tutsis within weeks and a few months after July 1994. So the recognition of the violence against Tutsis as a genocide came well before a court was able to judge that it was a genocide. These were academics, journalists, and particularly the RPF. Okay. So I don't think it necessarily needs a court per se, but implicit in that question, the wording was revenge killings by the RPF against Tutsis. How could we qualify that as a genocide? If you heard my talk, I see there are a number of people who had T-shirts made for this event, and you support perhaps the Rwandan government. But I made it very clear in my talk that the RPF immediately after shooting down the plane systematically killed Hutus in zones, and there were no killings of Tutsis in some of those zones that had occurred. This was not, these were not operations to avenge the killing of Tutsis. These were, in large part, highly organized operations to eliminate Tutsis.
Thank you, Ms. Rivera. Just for the sake of time, when you wrap up, Dean Wright has
Yes.
the floor. Thanks.
Well, thank you. We have students that have to get to their 2 o'clock classes. I want to thank everybody for being here. I want to thank our audience. I think our audience, this is a very emotional topic, and I think our audience has been very respectful. I think you've been open-minded, and that's where we make progress, is when we can listen to both sides. And again, as we said, there will be another event. But I want to thank our presenters for taking time out of their busy schedules, and also for those of you who have attended and participated, and maybe we'll see you again. Thank you.